Hi there, my name is Dorothea von Moltke. I'm one of the owners of Labyrinth Books, and I want to welcome all of you. I'm very happy that so many of you can be on this call for a conversation between Carolyn Walker-Bynum and Brooke Holmes. I see that there are 396 of you, and all here to listen in on this conversation about Professor Bynum's new book, Dissimilar, Similitudes, Devotional Objects in Late Medieval Europe. And there are people from Melbourne and England and Texas, and I have lost track where else. What I was wanting to say is that the presence of all of you, presence in your absence, really is a tribute to the fact that, of course, a new book from Carolyn Walker-Bynum is really just an occasion for a celebration. And I first want to quickly thank the Institute for Advanced Study, our co-sponsor tonight, for their help in getting word out. Thank you also to anyone at Columbia, at Rutgers, at Princeton, at Fordham, and everywhere else who helped forward our invitation. And finally, a quick shout out and thank you to our in-house medievalist at Labyrinth, my colleague Alana, who helped me in lots of ways. Some quick housekeeping notes. You can order Dissimilar Similitudes from us online for 10% off. There's a link in the bottom of your screen there in that green bar. Just be sure to enter promo code Bynum at checkout. And of course, you can also simply stop by the store to get that. You can order it over the phones. You can order it by sending an email to orders.labyrinth@gmail.com. And I've put all that information up at the top of the chat, which is getting long, so you don't have to scroll up. But it, of course, is also easy to find on labyrinthbooks.com. So I encourage you to get a copy of this beautiful book. I want to quickly mention that I'm actually going to take down that chat during the conversation, and then I'm going to put it back up during the Q&A. But please ask your questions not in the chat. Instead, on this platform, you can see there's an Ask a Question button at the bottom of your screen. And you can just go there as the questions come to you during the conversation, and feel free and encouraged to put them in there in the queue as you think of them. And we will then be sure to leave time for a Q&A. And now on to our guests who are here. Carolyn Walker-Bynum is a medieval scholar and professor emerita at Columbia University, as well as in the School of Historical Studies at the Institute for Advanced Study. Her work has been instrumental in introducing both the concept of gender and the history of the body into the study of medieval Christianity. And her influential books include Jesus as Mother, Studies in the Spirituality of the High Middle Ages, Fragmentation and Redemption, Essays on Gender and the Human Body in Medieval Religion, and Metamorphosis and Identity. Dissimilar Similitudes now follows on her previous acclaimed book, Christian Materiality, and I think our conversation might touch on that as well. I am delighted that Brooke Holmes is also able to be with us tonight. She is a professor of classics at Princeton with wide-ranging comparative interests, among which not least interests that she shares with Professor Bynum in the history of the body and in historical gender studies. That's clear in Brooke's first book, The Symptom and the Subject, The Emergence of the Physical Body in Ancient Greece, followed by Gender, Antiquity, and its Legacy. And currently she's at work on a study of the concept of sympathy in Hellenistic and Roman science, medicine, philosophy, and poetry, entitled The Tissue of the World, Sympathy, and the Nature of Nature in Greco-Roman Antiquity. What that interdisciplinary list, I think, elides is the fact that she actually also has a really alive interest in art, and especially in the lasting influence of antiquity in contemporary art. The essays that are collected in Professor Bynum's new book, I just want to quickly hold it up here so that you see the object. and we're going to turn to that now, are riveting and wide-ranging studies of devotional objects and practices, ranging from the use of miniature cribs and cradles for the infant Jesus, to the iconography and worship of the footprints left behind by Jesus in the moment of his ascension, with many points in between. And in one way or another, these essays all, I think, ask what in the material world helped the pious in late medieval Europe mediate their belief in the ineffable, mediate their belief in God. And the essays, they patiently teach us, the readers, how to think comparatively as well as how best not to. So to think about the implications of saying something is like something else. And in that sense, I think the book is a series of lessons for us and I'm going to borrow a formulation from its pages for what medieval devotional practice also entailed. So a lesson for us in both seeing and seeing beyond. And here now are Carolyn Bynum and Brooke Holmes. Welcome, both of you. I'm so delighted that you're with us. And I'm going to take myself out of the picture and take the chat down, and we will listen in.
So do you want to talk a little bit about why similitude was the subject that you took up in the book and how you understand it?
Sure. I guess the first thing I should say is that similitude itself has been very little theorized, even by art historians. When it has been, it's been really almost as if it's the question of representation. And there's been a certain amount of discussion of how far the sitter is similar to the portrait. But that, I mean, there's a very narrow understanding of similitude. And that's really the only way in which it's been discussed. There's a very recent German book called Similitudo, where they're starting to think about it, but it's all art history, and it's really within that narrow framework. And Dissimilar, Similitudes, that I use for the title is a quotation from Pseudo-Dionysius, who was a Neoplatonic writer of the late 5th or early 6th century, whose works were enormously influential in the Middle Ages. And what Pseudo-Dionysius said is that the things which refer to God, to heaven, to the other, are dissimilar similitudes, because it should be unlike rather than like, because God, the other, the all-powerful, is not like what's here on earth. But at the same time, there's an element of similitude. We are all figures to some extent of that which is involved with the other, because the other, God, created the world, and according to Genesis, created man in his image and likeness. So it's imago and similitudo, which devotional writers throughout the Middle Ages used to say that we had the imago, that is, we had the possibility of returning. We had lost the similitude because of sin. And part of the devotional effort should be to return to similitude. And this is already a complicated concept about how things relate to an other, how ordinary things relate to an other, which has analogies to what you do when you use historical evidence. How does the evidence get you to the other of the world that you're trying to conjure up? Likeness really is a theme in the book in two ways. The first two essays and the last essay, which are about specific devotional objects, are really about the ways in which these objects themselves tell you that they are both like and unlike the other toward which they ultimately point. And so one of my points there is to unpack, if you will, to talk about each one of these objects what the objects themselves tell us about what we should see and the kind of otherness that's built into them. So part of this is a little bit of a polemic with art historians, or at least those art historians who tend to think that what we should do to find out about devotional objects is read what the theologians and the liturgist and the ritual said about them. And I'm trying to say a lot of people didn't read the theologians and the liturgists and didn't even understand some of the liturgy that they were hearing, but they looked at the things, and the things tell you something about how to look at them. The other sort of axis of likeness in the book is in the central essays, which are more methodological, which raise the problem of likeness in a different sense, because likeness is, of course, an element in comparison. You can't compare unless you have two things that are in some way like each other. But what I'm trying to say is that we often make the wrong decisions about what's like something else. And so one of the essays is called Avoiding the Tyranny of Morphology. All that means is don't necessarily start with two things that look alike. I was talking yesterday to a young woman in Israel who's working on the parallels between mikvahs and Christian baptistry in the Rhineland. And I said to her, yes, but there's something more going on. Otherwise, if it's just water basins compared to water basins, you might as well compare it to a bathtub. And, you know, she laughed because the point is that you may start with things you think look alike, and they may end up being very different. You may start with a question like, how do you wash away sin? And then come to things which look both different and alike. So some of the essays are really trying to push at the issue really of, if you're going to compare, where do you start? And I think these two things are connected, because ultimately I'm talking in all of them about objects. And so I'm talking in all of them about objects which let us into their likeness and unlikeness. And therefore, I'm claiming that if you're going to compare, you're going to have to be interested in the unlikeness built into things as well as the likeness. And therefore, you shouldn't just start superficially with a goddess looks like a goddess, you know, or a bucket looks like a bucket, or a bathtub looks like a bathtub.
No, I want to come back to this question of comparison, but I want to stay a little bit longer with, you gave the Studio Dionysius example, and I think it illustrates really well how you're relating to other ways people have thought about meaning making, signification. And so with the idea of God as the image of man, you have both the icon, but you also have something like the index of the creator. But you don't want to use Peirce's categories, and I think you make a good argument for why they fail to capture the kind of likeness that you're interested in. And so I sort of started to hint at it, well, that both of these things are coming into play. But I wondered if you wanted to talk about how likeness for you sort of circumvents ways that we've thought about the relationship between a sign and its referent.
Well, yeah, I do make a complicated argument that Peirce's categories, icon, index, and symbol, don't really work for the kinds of objects that I'm talking about. For example, a reliquary, which constructs the way in which you see the relic, is both indexical, in that the Mary Magdalene reliquary that I talk about at some length, it's got her tooth in it. So it's indexical in the literal sense of index means actually connected to the thing. Icon means an image of, but not necessarily connected. And it's also very much iconic because the whole way in which the relic is constructed in that reliquary, as crystal and within curving golden vines, is that it's an image. It's a picture of ultimately what Magdalene will be like in heaven. That is, that she will be both crystalline and whole in her virtue, but forever growing in her spiritual experience. Because at least by this time in the Middle Ages, there's some very interesting notions about infinity and the fact that in heaven you would just keep on growing. I mean, it's actually very interesting from a scientific point of view. But in any case, and these things are clearly not symbols. That is, they're not just assigned a meaning. So I think that in some ways, the indexes end up being iconic, and some of the icons really end up being indexical because they are actually in some real sense a crucifix is in some real sense, particularly if it has a relic in it, in some real sense, an index that is connected to the other. So when I use those kinds of categories that other people have tended to use, I mostly sort of end up saying, yeah, they're helpful, but what I really want people to do is to look and to think about what the objects are made out of, what glass means, what gold means, what thread means. The little Beguine bed that I talk about in the first essay, which is a baby bed, which is also made to look like a church, and it has spires on the corner, and it has a cover lid, which is really like an altar cloth. And so you've got a bed, which is also a church, which is also an altar, which is ultimately the place in which the baby Jesus would arrive, either on Christmas or in the midst of a devotional experience. So those are the kind of ways in which I think modern semiotics doesn't necessarily get us very far. It gets us someplace. I mean, you need to understand what an index and an icon are if you want to mix up the terms. But I don't think it gets us very far. What we need to do really, I think, is start talking again about what it means for something to be dissimilarly like. And I don't have a new semiotics. I don't have a new theory of similitude. But I think people are beginning to ask about it. And we may be on the cusp of that being a new theoretical question. Mm-hmm. But one of the things I want to push is let's do it, at least for now, let's do it from specific objects, cribs and crowns and dresses for statues and reliquaries and specific things that will tell us something about how complex it is to look.
And it seems to me that partly why the semiotic schemes sort of elide what you're interested in is that what you're deeply interested in is the agency of these objects and how they're vectors for power and sacred power. And so similitude becomes a kind of mechanism for the circulation of divine power, but similitude is operating in these multiple registers, and the multiplicity of the registers is part of the way in which the power is not pure, it's not just God, but it's God and something else. I mean, I wonder if that's an accurate way of thinking about the privileging of agency, maybe in relationship to similitude. And I wonder if it would help if you talked a little bit about how this project relates to Christian materiality, where you were very interested in matter and the relationship of matter and power, and why these objects and in their materiality matter so much to becoming vectors of power rather than images themselves or lookalikes being the vectors of power.
Yeah, it's two questions, and they're good questions. The first one about agency is I want to say that I talked some in the introduction about the various kinds of ways people have talked about objects having agency, and try to nuance that, because it's perfectly clear that the ways in which people, and there's been a lot of discussion of the agency of objects, a lot of it from anthropologists, a lot of historians using Alfred Gell. And there are very different ways in which one talks about objects acting. Certainly in this period, some objects act because some paintings come alive and perform miracles. And that's a different kind of way of acting than something which will be part of ritual, which will sort of march through a church, which will have a kind of a charge to it and have a kind of power, so that some people will feel that it actually acts upon them and they can act with it. But this is going to be different from, a statue or a picture, which actually comes alive. And then you've got the third category of really very ordinary objects like oats and water and the things that the clergy supposedly blessed at Christmas time. And then people took the oats home to feed to their cows to make them fertile. And they took the water home to heal people. And sometimes, of course, they kept on filling up the holy water bucket until there's a real question of how much is it really going to still be effective. So there are all kinds of interesting questions about agency here. But I think that's one of the things that we need to unpack a little bit, because there's sometimes been a tendency to actually assume that kind of everything medieval has agency. And people in the Middle Ages had ordinary buckets and shovels and this kind of thing, just as we do. So the agency question is complicated. Now, how this relates to Christian materiality, because in Christian materiality, one of the things that I'm talking about is concepts of the material which underlie what's happening in a whole range of Christian devotional experiences. So the first chapter is called Visual Matter and Its Own Objects. The second and third chapters are about other things than images. In other words, not paintings and sculpture, but things like the oaks that are blessed or the holy water, or other kinds of things, which also have a certain kind of agency, but a different kind of agency. And then the last chapter is actually on sort of scientific writing in the period, as well as some literary writing, where I argue that this is the period in European history, especially the 14th and 15th centuries, when people were concerned with things coming alive. I mean, this is the period in which alchemy takes off, and people really believe you can change something into gold. This is the period in which in literature we have all sorts of transformation stories. This is the great period of werewolf stories. This is the period of the stories of Melusine. And this is the period in which we have the new miracles, the absolutely new bodily miracles like the stigmata, which simply weren't before the late 12th, early 13th centuries, and mystical pregnancy and levitation and all sorts of actual changes. So I argued that there's a kind of a mood, if you will, a kind of change in Europe that one can also see in the scientists who are talking about the nature of matter, that makes matter more labile and more sort of apt to come alive. This is a period, obviously, in which people believed in spontaneous generation. So there's a kind of a theory of materiality underlying various kinds of ways in which objects, as you rightly say, in which objects act. And the real difference between that, which is a general effort to survey the period, and this book, is that this book does move from theories of matter to particular objects, and to theories of objects and how we need to talk about objects. So some new issues come up, and it is trying to do, insofar as it's doing what it's doing, is trying to work from particular examples to show what would happen, what does happen, if we learn to look more carefully, and if we learn to be careful about what we see when we look, and not just assume that we know what it is or that we know that it's like something else.
That's really helpful. And I think one way that I was trying to imagine as you were speaking, the relationship between the earlier book and this book, but also any theories of matter and the arguments that you're making, is that one might imagine that in a culture that's permeated by Christianity, that theories of matter, understandings of matter are permeating all objects. And if you wanted to zoom out even more broadly beyond the cultural context, if you're taking a phenomenological approach, an object may suggest to you how it is to be used, to think about the idea of an affordance. And so when you say that the Beguine cradle wants us to look to see how it is to be used, you could say, well, all objects in some way do that. But of course, you're drawing a narrower category. And I think that maybe it would be wonderful to think of, I don't know if you have the image of that, maybe we don't want to go with the tech, but the image of the Beguine cradle, because the one thing that seems really key are these devotional objects, these objects that are made to be looked at in a particular way, that stage this particular quality of matter to stage presence and absence. And you talk in the book about Christianity as a religion obsessed with these questions of absence and presence. So I wonder if you wanted to get into the specifics, because you went into it a little bit before, but it's so great to hear you talk through the specifics when you say, how is this object as a devotional object inviting us to imagine how to look at it without looking as devotional looking, and implicated in a meditation on a particular sacred question of presence and absence.
Just so you know, I think that everyone can right now see the big wind cradle. Can you guys see it?
I can.
Okay, good.
I hope everybody can see it because it's gorgeous, and it's more gorgeous here than it is in the book because here it's in color, which is nice. Just to say a couple of words about what Brooke said at the beginning about theories of matter. I do think it's important to keep in the back of our minds, which is very much in my mind in Christian Materiality and also in this book, that despite all...
Uh-oh. Oh, no.
In this period of everything. Oops.
Carolyn, we lost the image. We lost you just for like 5 seconds, and then we lost the image.
I took the image down because we lost Carolyn, and I opted for Carolyn over the image.
Well, maybe the image can come back. I'll just finish this one thing about theories of matter, and then maybe the image can come back. In theories of matter, I just wanted to say that despite all this talk about dualism in the Middle Ages, moral dualism and ontological dualism, there is, in fact, of course, a tremendous sense of a chain of being, of creation, all the way down to the lowest slug. And there is a sense in which everything is supposed to point to God because God has created it. So that even when you get to Calvin, even when you get to people in the early modern period who want to get rid of the visual entirely, they still talk about the glories of nature as a way of getting to God. So the vaunted are often spoken about dualism of the Middle Ages doesn't really work when we start thinking about matter. Just not to say they don't have a sense of evil. Okay, enough about that. But here's the example of one of the objects that I talk about in the first chapter. This is a little bed. It's in the Metropolitan Museum. And as you can see, it's a bed. It's a bed. It has little bells around the top where you might ring bells to soothe or stimulate a baby, which people did in the Middle Ages too. And yet at the same time, clearly, although this hasn't really been written about, at the same time, it's clearly a church. Look, it has the little windows all along the side, and the 4 posts are the spires of the church. It's got an ogival arch back here. It's got angels on the tips of the spires. So this is both a bed and a church. And when you look at the coverlids, which you can't really see here, but one is a tree of Jesse, and it builds up to the Lamb of God, which is on the pillow. And this is the kind of thing, of course, that you would not have had in a baby bed, but you would have had on an altar. So in a very real sense, this object is a bed, an altar, a church, all of which are places that would have received the baby Jesus. And some objects like this were used at Christmas, and you waited until at Christmas you put the baby in the crib, which some people still do today with nativity scenes. They were also used, and this is a gender element I don't have time to go into. This is from a woman's house. They were very popular with women's houses, and they were used by women as in their cells as devotional objects, so that they often had Jesus dolls, which they put into the crib. And this is part of a complicated devotion in which the bed, the church, the altar is also the individual heart. And we can see that in other images. And I have a marvelous meditation in Dutch from exactly the same period at which the Begwin cradle was made, that was written for women, in which we have figures like oratio and meditatio, putting the baby to bed in the cradle. And then we have the woman growing up from being the caretaker of the baby and being the bed herself to become the golden throne in heaven on which Christ, the adult Christ, sits. And so you can see how complicated are the images in which these people thought. And just a simple object like this, it's usually sort of shoved to the side in the Met. Nobody pays too much attention to it. It is a glorious example of the multivalence of an object and of how it is both itself and other, because ultimately it's the receptacle of the heart for the divine to come into it.
Yeah. I mean, I have so many questions, but I'm going to limit. I have one I want to ask just particularly about that multivalence, because one of the things you talk about with the other bed object in this first chapter is the Burgundian crush. And there you really emphasize the spectrum of sensory responses. And so it's the multivalence of seeing multiple things in the same shape, but also the activation of multiple senses that seems so important to your analysis. Here, tactility and sight, but with the Burgundian crush, you talk about hearing, you talk about smell being modeled. And so I wondered if you wanted to bring that kind of the spectrum of the sensorium into play, because it does seem to also be part of your resistance to visual culture as the expanded term to take these objects into consideration with.
Yeah, I could say a little bit. Unfortunately, we don't have a slide of the Burgundian crush, and I would urge you, it's in the Met. It's in the Met in the same room, the main medieval room when you go in, and it's an absolutely wonderful sort of tableau. And
did you send that one? Did you send that one, Carolyn?
No, I didn't.
No, right, okay.
I'm showing it.
Sort of see it, yeah. It's the only object that I have found with extensive research where we have both an empty crib and the baby in the manger floating above. We sometimes have a floating baby and we sometimes have an empty manger. This is the only object I've found anywhere, and nobody else has found it either, although there's not been much written about this, but the people who've written have said it's unique. And I argue that we really do have the five senses illustrated here. We have the shepherds listening with their hands to their ears. They're clearly listening. We have the angels looking, and we have the ox and the ass. The baby is touching the ox, and the ass is actually chewing on the baby's cloth here. And then, of course, we have Joseph airing the swaddling clothes, and so he's not holding his nose, but it seems pretty clearly to be evoking smell. So we do, it's very sensual, and at the same time, we have the empty crib in the middle with the mother looking up towards the baby in the manger who hasn't, for her, arrived yet. And so for all the presence and for all the visuality, the mother is still waiting in contemplation, which makes so clear that the crib that is empty is really her heart, and that she's waiting for the child to come into her heart. So this is just an example. And as I say, nobody's written about the sensual aspects of this, the way in which the five senses are, I think, very clearly depicted. And so, again, I think it becomes an interesting object. It tells you how to look, and you have to really look. But if you look and think and notice what's not there, the emptiness as well as the presence, you're going to see the way in which it carries one in some way beyond. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because, and it can remind one of the text. Mary kept all these things and pondered them in her heart, which comes a bit later in the gospel stories. But in any case, that's a nice contrast between the sensual experience and the waiting, which is the same kind of thing that you find in other crib images. And in texts about cribs, we have lots of text about the beds of the heart. Although I'm trying, as I say, to let the objects speak more than the text, but I've got a lot of text too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, there's something about the durational experience of sitting with a layered object like that, which invites multiple perspectives and the movement around it, that seems so crucial to its special category of a devotional object. I wanted to ask you a question. I think I have two more. I have many questions, but I'm going to try to limit myself to two, and then maybe open it up, because we started a little bit late, so I'm going to take a little bit more time.
Sure.
But one is, I mean, you speak really powerfully and in complexly about the persistence of another kind of object in history in the 4th chapter, about these objects which were venerated as anti-Semitic, as objects where Jews being accused of the desecration of the host may have been executed, may be imprinted by their punishment, and how this nexus of desecration, punishment, produces in these objects a form of holiness. And then the role of this holiness, or this power in these objects, in relationship to what objects do in relationship to historical memory in the present. So it's a very, in some ways, seems to be quite a different kind of object than the devotional object that one passes by in the Met. And I wondered if I could ask you to talk a little bit about how you see these objects as activating this category of dissimilar similitudes in similar ways or in different ways, and maybe to talk a little bit about the museological implications or the implications for the historian of these objects that are vectors of violence and anti-Semitic violence in particular in European Christianity.
Yeah, the burden of that essay really is to explore what modern Germans have done, the hard decisions they've had to make about how to either retain or remove, and if retain, how to bracket, how to talk about these horrible objects that were used to accuse Jews, and in many cases led to pogroms, particularly by the 15th century. So I'm talking about the objects themselves, such as the footprints that are supposedly the footprints of the rabbi's wife when she tried to throw a consecrated host into the river and was punished by sinking into the stone. And so there are the footprints, and they're still on the side of the church at Sternberg. Inside at Sternberg, they have a table on which it says, this is the table on which the Jews martyred the host. And that has become a memorial to the Holocaust, with a menorah in front and a long statement, really a statement of mea culpa, that this is what we contributed to. And it talks about the long tradition of anti-Semitism coming from this period right down into the 20th century. And another part of the essay is really a horrible part, where I try to talk, as Brooke suggested, about the ways in which this Christian need for holy matter, this Christian need for stuff that would act, and particularly for the stuff of the Eucharist that would act, contributed to the anti-Semitism. In other words, we have to understand that the Christians, it's a horrible thing to say, but the Christians needed the Jews to make this holy matter. They needed somebody to violate the host. They needed somebody to violate their images. And this then produced the holy matter, the bleeding host, which could become a center of a pilgrimage. It could become a center of a communion. And so one of the things I'm trying to do is to explain that there are ways in which medieval theology and this particular idea of holy matter contributed to some of the horror of the anti-Semitism. It isn't just that they wanted to take Jewish property, or that they felt a competition with Jews, or that they didn't like moneylenders. It goes much, much deeper in the theology, and that's one of the points I'm trying to make. But the other point of the essay is to talk about the ways in which modern Germans have chosen to deal with this horrible heritage that they have. And there's a recent book that just came out by Susan Neiman called Learning from the Germans, where she argues that the ways in which Germans have dealt with these survivals of anti-Semitic objects, not by removing them, but by framing them, by glossing them in such ways that people have to encounter what was done every time they go past this object. You don't just remove it and put it in the basement and say, well, we're not guilty anymore, we don't have it. And she argues that this should be a model for how we deal with racist objects today. And I have actually this summer written a piece. I was asked to write a piece on Confederate memorials in the South where I grew up. And I try in that to use some of the ideas that come out in my essay about these anti-Semitic objects and some of the kind of things that Susan Neiman has said to suggest that there's something in that approach that modern Germans have found a way to frame the horrors of their past that might give us some guidance for what we do with the horrors of our past. In other words, we don't just take the statues down and put them someplace else, but we do the kind of thing that people have done when they project an image of George Floyd onto the pedestal where there was before an image of Robert E. Lee. So I'm also trying to use some of the lessons that I think one can learn from how horrible medieval objects have to be dealt with to talk about current issues.
I want to just follow up on that because I think, it's such a difficult and also very pressing issue. And it seems to me you make a claim, maybe if I could even, I'm not going to push you, but say you make the claim we need these objects, we can't bury them, we can't put them away, but you also make the claim we need the objects. And that goes back to what you were saying about the particular role of these objects as vectors of power. And I'm wondering, what you were describing was making me think about the broader, the longer history of the body and, contemporary inflections of biopolitics and the ways in which the integrity of the body or the integrity of something material seen as whole, its violation is needed in order to affirm that purity. And I think about that through, say, Philhellenism in the 19th century and vitalism and those kinds of later inflections of a kind of racist biopolitics. But what you're saying is also introducing this idea of a purity that is only made clear by its violation. And so you need the foreign element in order to produce the violation, and you need God to sort of reassert that. And I wonder if there's something, I'm still struggling with the claim that you make. It's not just enough to have the memories or to have even pictures, but you have to have the objects. If there's something about the way in which these powers are still circulating, that we think they're gone. And in fact, the objects help us understand that, this is Trumpism, that the energies of racial hatred are there. They weren't, we can't put them in the past. And I just wonder I don't know if I'm reading you right, but I wonder if you could say something about specifically the importance of the objects there in line with the broader argument of the book.
No, it's a good question. After all, that the book is arguing about objects. Let me just use one example from the work I was doing this summer on the Confederate memorials, and to simply say, shorthand, I grew up in Atlanta, very close to the Stone Mountain Memorial. The Stone Mountain Memorial is this huge memorial to the generals in the Civil War on the side of a great big monadnock, one of these huge stone things that rears up out of the earth. Never was finished and was enormously admired, and they had chairlifts going up to it and this kind of thing. And my argument, which is an argument that some other people have made too, is you don't just go and blast that off. Then you still got a mountain that people can climb, and you still got a chairlift that can go to the top. And in 25 years, nobody's going to remember. So what you do is you you bash it up a little bit and you let that wonderful southern enemy, the kudzu vine, get up there and grow into the cracks, so that what you've got a mutilated object where people can see the whole history of admiring it. I mean, I grew up with these stories of Margaret Mitchell having a picnic on the shoulder of Robert E. Lee and how wonderful this was, and, Gone with the Wind and all this kind of stuff. And so what you do is that children then see when they come, and adults see too, they see what it was. They see that there was a reaction against it. And then you can talk about why there's a reaction against it. So I think in that sense, a mutilated object can carry more than the absence of an object. Now, these things get complicated. There's Brian Stevenson's project for the lynching sites, to collect the dirt from lynching sites. The sites don't exist anymore, but once again, that's an effort to get an object that you can take and put someplace and label, so that people can say, here's where so-and-so was lynched. And you know that because the actual dirt is there. And I think the same kind of thing is true about these anti-Semitic objects in Germany. I mean, it's very interesting. For example, there was a sign on a crossroads in southern Germany which said, here is where the Jews martyred the host. And when the American troops came through, the American troops forced a German to come and paint over this thing in black paint. But it stayed until, about 20 years ago when it was taken down. There's something sort of powerful about that sitting there as obliterated, so that it has to be explained. I'm not saying everything should be left, but that's the kind of answer that I make. And I do think, although it's a complicated point, I do think there are some things that the Germans have done well with commemorating the horrors of the Holocaust that we could learn from. I don't want to push that too far because I have some reservations about it too.
Thank you. And I think there may be other questions in the chat. I mean, it's certainly a very live and difficult issue. I'm still going to take my liberty of asking my last question, because it comes back to this this point, which is the way that your method works in this book and in so many other books, between difference. I don't even want to say between the universal and the particular, between what I think of as scales of specificity, and in a very complicated and compelling way that's always very careful. And I think that this, so this question of objects in a Christian context as opposed to objects in any context, I think is in the background of much of what you were just saying. And I wanted to take that as an invitation to ask you to just say something, and I'll stop talking so you can talk about the kind of lessons of the comparative work that you did in the Tyranny of Morphology. So to ask the question that your friend asks, what did you learn from looking at Hindu religiosity, particularly the linga, and looking at Christian Christian religious practice and the root of Christ?
Yeah, there is an essay where what I'm doing is using comparative material, Christian Europe, and Hindu practices and objects in India. And actually in the last essay too, where I deal with devotion to footprints, I also have some comparison between Christian devotion to footprints and devotion to footprints in other in other religions, Muslim as well as Hindu. And the point that I'm trying to make in that essay is the one I was mentioning earlier, that if we start with things that we think look alike, we're only going to find at most a difference between those things. And this may not get us very far in understanding a culture or a religion, because how do we know we've picked things that are really comparable, things that are equally important in the different traditions? And so what I do in that essay, and I won't go through all of it, but what I do in that essay is to compare goddess processions in Hinduism and in Catholicism, in this country and in Varanasi, and to talk about the ways in which in the Christian goddess processions, the goddess goes out and she marches all around and she goes back to the church. In the Hindu goddess procession, the goddess goes out and she marches all around and she ends up being thrown in the river. And I say those things are not the same. And that tells us something about the whole attitude of the culture towards the organic. The goddess can go back to the river in Hinduism. You would not throw a statue of the Virgin Mary out here into the Hudson. You would get into real trouble if you did. So what I'm trying to say is maybe that's a useful question, but maybe we should try to think about how each of these objects tells us something about how in their religions the organic world is related to. And maybe we could then find other objects which didn't look as much alike as a goddess like a goddess, but that would get us further into seeing the comparison, the likeness, and the difference of the attitude toward the organic world.
That's great. And I would have even more questions, but I'm going to let other people ask questions. I know there are a few in the queue, and Dorothea is monitoring the questions. So thank you so much. And let me turn it over to Dorothea so she can introduce.
Thank you, Brooke. Thank you. Great question.
Yeah. Thank you from me also. And it's been riveting to listen to you. I'm so glad that we persisted through the tech troubles. Thank you both for your patience with that. Thanks everyone on this call for their patience. I think we were richly rewarded. Your discussion has really given a sense of the incredible range of the essays and the questions that it raises and all it gives us to think about. And I am going to just turn to the first question here that several people have indicated they're also interested in. And it follows up a little bit, Brooke, on your question about the engagement of all the senses, which is so remarkable. And Caroline, when you're seeing, you're always doing more than seeing the objects in front of you in this book. So here comes a question from Whitney Shaw. When it comes to devotional objects, is it only visual similitudes or dissimilitudes that matter? Is it worthwhile to think about similitudes that are auditory, tactile, etc.? And finally, what about similitudes that may not be sensible at all, but predominantly intelligible? So it's really pushing to extend that question.
Yeah, and that's great. That's great. And I certainly do think that what we understand as the five senses should be brought in much more and could be brought in if we would see objects more in a devotional setting. And I was in several cases writing about objects in museums where we don't, unfortunately, have the chance to have much of an activation of smell, and usually even not much of an activation of sound. So it would be important ultimately to think about these things in a ritual context, where they would not only be smelling and ringing and sounding and something you could look at, but they'd actually be moving. One thing I find very interesting is that I've noted that there's a new theory about the unicorn tapestries in Paris, which have always been understood as being about the five senses. And then there's a sixth tapestry, and nobody has had any idea, what it was. And there's a new theory now that it is, of course, the internal sense, that to medieval thinkers, there was an inner sense which pulled the other senses together. And I was thinking about this even in terms of the Burgundian crèche. You could think possibly of Mary as being the inner sense that's pulling everything together in addition to her contemplative stance. But you are certainly right that the more we could do, I was able to get that crib out of the case and look at it and turn it over, because I wanted to find out whether there actually was a place for a relic, and there is a place for a relic. But to have it out, to handle it, to make the bells ring, because it does have elements of sound, was a whole different experience from just looking at it in a glass case. So this is an argument for getting your curators to let you have some hands-on experience with some of these objects, or finding them in churches where maybe you can convince somebody, you can at least be there for a service and see them paraded around.
Yeah. Caroline, there's another question in the queue that follows up on the Burgundian cribs, and is curious to know whether, as objects, the crib, you had mentioned that they are the heart, right? They represent also the heart. Whether that can be said to be connected to the Sacred Heart tradition.
That I don't think so. I think it more connects to the tradition of the bed of the heart as the place where grace arrives. And I think that's where it fits into a theological tradition. There is, with women religious, some interest in the Sacred Heart in this period, but not nearly as much as you would think if you read the modern literature, which tries to push the Sacred Heart devotion back further really than it goes. So I think it's not Sacred Heart stricto sensu in the sense that the Sacred Heart, Christ opens his chest and you see the blood. It's not that kind of heart. It's the heart as the place of rest. It's the heart where grace arrives. It's that often envisions the woman will see a cradle with flowers in it, with roses in it. So it's a little bit that kind of heart. And the Sacred Heart really is part of a more bloody, literally, and frightening, a lot of people kind of image that comes along a bit later. Now, some of the people I quote here do talk about the Sacred Heart in devotional literature, but images of it are a bit later.
Yeah. Maybe we can go now to a question that follows up on your conversation about the chapter dealing with the anti-Semitic objects, where Thomas Dale is interested in what you have to say about these horrible objects which were used in anti-Jewish polemics, and the necessity of having these narratives in order to elevate Christian sacred matter. And he is wondering if this can further be contextualized in the context of Crusades and the construction of a white European Christendom, mentioning that Madeleine Cabanis has spoken about the emergence of a porcelain whiteness in medieval art beginning in the 13th century.
Yeah, and I don't want to give the impression that that I think there was anything good about the way in which anti-Semitism contributed to the emergence of these kinds of objects, because there was a need for holy matter. And there's no question that in our earliest stories of holy matter, really in the late 12th and 13th centuries, even early 14th centuries, it's often just simple people, children or women or peasants, who encounter a Eucharistic host that's bleeding. And sometimes sometimes it heals, and sometimes it's people who in innocence have taken it out of the church and they think it's going to work miracles for them, so they take it and they sprinkle it on their cabbage or feed it to their pigs or whatever, and they think that it will make them more fertile. It's an ignorant kind of devotion, but it doesn't have that malignant overtone, which by the time we move into the 15th century, I'm arguing that because there's this increasing need for this holy stuff, this bleeding stuff, and you begin to have permanent pilgrimages to it. In the earlier period, if you had one of these bleeding hosts, the priest was supposed to immediately eat it. You weren't supposed to leave it. It would be too dangerous. By the later Middle Ages, it becomes the center of a cult. And so it's a very different kind of thing, and there's a real need for it if people want to establish pilgrimages. I don't know that it relates directly to the Crusades, although certainly there are things that go along with the Crusades that I talk about in this book that are relevant, both the kind of tokens that Crusaders brought back, the kind of marks that Crusaders had on their bodies, that in some ways mimic stigmata and this kind of thing. I'm not sure that there's a close connection between these bleeding host cults and the Crusades, although the Crusades are fundamental, and some of the other things I talk about in the last chapter when I talk about the footprints of Christ, it's Crusaders and pilgrims who bring back the footprints in all sorts of different ways to Europe. And so in that sense, the objects that I talk about are connected to the Crusades. And as far as color is concerned, red and white, that would take some more thinking. One of our problems is that we so often don't have the vivid paint that was there, except in paintings. But on these statues, on these devotional objects, often most of the color is gone. And this again makes it difficult to think the significance of the color and what it meant when people carried the objects. It's much easier to work on color when you're working on manuscript pages, where often the pictures have survived. But that wasn't in this book what I was working on. I wasn't even working on painted panels.
Right, yeah. Let's move on to a question here that Will has, and others have indicated they're also interested in. I'm going to just read it. It was mentioned earlier that some objects want to be used. I'm curious if the human element is required for activation. And
I couldn't hear, Dorothea.
Okay.
It went way in the middle.
Okay, let me just start over. I'm going to read Will's question. And that is, it was mentioned earlier that some objects want to be used. I'm curious if the human element is required for activation. And if so, where does it come into play with an object acting on the people by whom it wants to be used? Or do these objects have an agency outside of and beyond the human?
Yeah, that's a great question, because that's a clarification we need to make. When we talk about the agency of objects, I don't want to suggest that all these objects have the same kind of agency, because they don't. But there are cases of objects which just choose to act. The Virgin of the Prison in Prado, there's a child and she sees this woman come alive and get down off the wall and start cleaning up. And presumably there's nothing other than the fact that a child is playing there and is curious that triggers this. Although if an object is going to act on its own, somebody's got to see it or we won't know. So in that sense, there's going to be at least a viewer. There are other objects that, of course, and that was what I was trying to do to make precise some differences. There are objects which act because they're consecrated and would not act if they weren't consecrated. Although that gets complicated when people start thinking, well, my oats were next to his oats and his oats were blessed and they did pretty well with our cattle. So maybe our oats will act too to cure this particular cattle disease. So there are all kinds of ways in which human agency is involved. And after all, the objects are not going around interacting with each other for the most part. They're humans there, which are involved, and we don't want to think that agency means the same thing in all the different cases. I don't know whether that answers the question, but
yeah, no, I would think so. Yeah, and I think we have time maybe for two more, though there are more dropping in as people are mulling this conversation. Here is one about the sort of limit cases of the notion of dissimilitude. So could you talk about, and this is Andrew Sears, could you talk about at what point dissimilitudes become irreconcilable? For instance, how the crib as the heart is also connected to markets, artistic laborers, and things that are vehemently not part of the experience that the object is supposed to promote.
Well, yes, of course. I don't mean this as a cosmic theory of objects. And in a way, this relates to the previous question. I don't want all agencies to sound alike, and certainly I don't think all dissimilar aspects of something that's a devotional object are equally important. But I am talking about devotional objects, and I'm trying to talk about what they do and what is done with them. There are all sorts of other questions that can be raised about the manufacture of them and the use of them. In the second chapter, where I talk about nuns' crowns, I have some very nice stories about, well, one of them is a very nice story about a goldsmith who is cured. And he sort of says to the Virgin Mary, "What should I do?" And she says, "Make me a crown." So he makes her a crown, and he goes to the convent. And although it's a convent of women, they let him in, and they let him come to the high altar and put the crown on the figure. The crown is still there. So that's a way in which the workman and what he was doing intersects with the object. But then we also have other objects. We have these little paper mache cards that the nuns used to pray with in the later Middle Ages, which are marvelous little objects because they're very tactile. They're almost like Braille, and they use them running their fingers around to pray. So this is the senses in another sense. Now we know these were made by workmen. This is a kind of paper mache, and they're made, they're squeezed out in molds, and they're made by people, and they're paid for. And so whether those people considered that it had any religious significance or not is a very, very interesting question. I mean, that's why the question of the goldsmith is interesting, because he clearly thought something had happened and he wanted to give a present back, and he gave the present to the Madonna. Mm-hmm. Which is a nice thing to do. But there are all sorts of other questions, and there are all sorts of other economic questions too, that of course I don't get into because that's not what I'm writing about. But it's worth noting that these women's communities that I've worked on so much, and that I often call the first women's movement in history, which they are, at the same time, in many cases, they were limited to the high aristocracy. We have almost no cases where even the bourgeois were able to join, and certainly not peasant girls. They would be servants in the kitchen. So there are all sorts of class elements here that could and should be talked about.
Yeah. So the last question, although then I will also ask you to let us know if your piece on the Confederate memorials has been published and where we can find it, and maybe you can tell us that when we wrap up. But I wanted to give the last question to a graduate student who, this is Elisa. "You're known as the queen of discursive footnotes among my graduate cohort," she says. "They not only provide extensive citations, but offer reading recommendations, context, and commentary. The result is transparency and insight into the process of your scholarship in addition to its results. Can you comment on that aspect of your writing?"
Thank you. There's a big debate, of course, among scholars and medievalists are very prominent in it about where the footnotes go. And most people feel the footnotes should go at the bottom of the page. And indeed, people get furious if they don't have their footnotes at the bottom of the page. And it's a regular thing in reviews. You're supposed to say, "What a shame that the publishers didn't put the footnotes at the bottom of the page." Zone doesn't put the footnotes at the bottom of the page. They put them in the back. And to tell you the truth, I like it because it enables me to do exactly what you're talking about. And I think since I tend to make an argument rather than presenting material, if you're presenting material, you want to look at the bottom of the page and say, where did it come from? But if you're making an argument, you want people to read through. You want there to be a kind of rhythm of the reading, and you want the prose to carry them. And then maybe at the end of the section, and I always break things up into fairly small sections, then at the end of the section, you can flip to the back and look at the footnotes. But I myself like to read that way. When I'm reading a book that's highly argued or highly theorized, I read for a stretch and then go back and look at the footnotes. So, I mean, these are different philosophies, and I will admit that most medievalists disagree with me. But this is a place where Zone's strategy and my strategy dovetail. And I'm glad at least that you find it useful.
Yeah, good. Both of you, you know, Carolyn, I told you that my favorite chapter is actually the footprint chapter, and it gave me so much to think about a different dyad, not the dissimilar and the similar, but absence and presence. And you really, in that chapter, are so masterful at teaching us another thing, which is how to pay attention to the gap between absence and presence. And now in this conversation, I feel like you've broadened that in ways I will continue to think about long after we stop talking here, in your conversation about the mutilated object versus the absent object. So there's so much that I know I will continue to mull and think about, talk about with others. I hope the same is true for many who have joined us tonight, that you will go to the book, bring your questions to the book, and then bring the questions to each other, and have the conversation continue in that way. I just encourage you again to order your book from Labyrinth and get your discount. I always say, especially because people tune in from anywhere and everywhere, which is so wonderful, wherever you get your book from, please support an independent local bookstore during this time with that purchase. That would mean a lot to me. It doesn't have to be Labyrinth, but make sure you're buying from a brick and mortar store. So that's my closing plea, but much more importantly, my thanks to both of you for your time, for your thought, and for your warmth in this hour and a half that we've had together. So take care, and hope to see you in the real world soon.
Oh, thank you.
Good night to all of you. Bye-bye.
Thank you to both of you. Great questions.
Thank you, Carolyn.